The Pacific Ocean, June 1944. A wall of steel and flame was moving west. A relentless tide of American ships, guns, and men pushing toward the heart of Japan's empire. At the center of that advance stood an island called Saipan, just 15 miles long, covered in dense jungle, jagged cliffs, and volcanic rock. To Tokyo, it was the outer fortress of the homeland. To the Americans, it was the key to victory. Whoever controlled Saipan would control the skies over Japan itself. For the Japanese garrison dug into its hills and caves, there would be no retreat, no surrender, no mercy. They had sworn to fight to the last man. They believed they were ready. They were wrong. On the morning of June 15, 1944, the sea off Saipan exploded into chaos. Over 500 U.S. Navy ships formed a line of thunder, battleships, destroyers, and troop carriers, unleashing one of the heaviest bombardments of the Pacific War. Shells screamed overhead. The beaches turned to smoke and sand. When the barrage finally lifted, the horizon shifted again. This time with the silhouettes of 8,000 amphibious landing craft carrying more than 70,000 American Marines and soldiers. As the first wave approached the shore, Japanese gunners opened fire. Machine guns tore into the water. Artillery shells burst in columns of spray, and landing craft vanished beneath explosions. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions charged straight into it, fighting their way off the beaches under a storm of fire. Men fell, others crawled through the shallows, dragging the wounded behind them. By the end of the first day, over 2,000 Americans were dead or wounded, and the Japanese still held the high ground. From deep inside their caves, Japanese officers watched the assault and laughed. They believed the Americans relied too heavily on firepower, that their new flamethrower tanks and handheld flamers were unreliable, clumsy, and weak. They had been told that no weapon could drive them from the bunkers carved into volcanic rock. But the Americans were adapting. By nightfall, the beaches were secured. Engineers began clearing mines and obstacles, while tanks rolled forward through fire and wreckage. Behind them, Navy ships pounded the ridges hour after hour, turning the island's greenery into dust. And then came the heat. As Marines advanced inland, the fighting grew tighter, from open beaches to the dense, suffocating interior. The Japanese had transformed every hill into a fortress, every cave into a death trap. Grenades and rifles weren't enough. Even artillery couldn't reach deep enough to clear them. The enemy seemed to vanish into the rocks, only to reappear behind the lines at night, attacking with bayonets and screams. So, the Americans brought forward their secret weapon, one that would soon redefine close-quarters warfare in the Pacific. The M2 flamethrower, a 70-pound inferno strapped to a Marine's back. At first, it was awkward, heavy, and terrifying even to use. But on Saipan, it would become the most feared weapon of the war. By the second week of fighting, the Japanese laughter would stop, replaced by something else. The sound of fire roaring into caves, the echo of screams in the smoke, and the realization that Saipan had become a place from which no one would escape alive. After securing the beaches, the Marines began pushing inland. What they found was not a battlefield. It was a labyrinth of death. The Japanese had spent months fortifying Saipan. Hills, cliffs, and sugarcane fields had been carved into layers of bunkers and tunnels, linked by hidden passages. Every approach was covered by machine guns, mortars, and snipers. Caves became fortresses, cliffs became gun towers, and even the night offered no safety. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions advanced yard by yard. Each ridge had to be taken the hard way, with grenades, satchel charges, and courage. Casualties mounted quickly. Entire squads vanished in seconds. By the 3rd day, the Marines had learned that conventional firepower wasn't enough. The Japanese fought from positions immune to artillery. They would hide until a unit passed, then attack from behind. It was in this nightmare terrain that the flamethrower found its purpose. At first, it was seen as a cumbersome novelty, a last resort tool carried by a single man with 70 pounds of fuel on his back and a match in his hand. But in the caves of Saipan, it became indispensable. Marines began using flamethrowers methodically. Riflemen would cover the operator, pinning enemy fire. Engineers with satchel charges waited behind. Once the nozzle ignited, streams of burning fuel blasted into the dark. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Caves that had resisted hours of bombardment were cleared in seconds. The heat reached 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, sucking the oxygen out of enclosed spaces. Inside, Japanese defenders suffocated before the flames even reached them. Each attack followed the same brutal rhythm: suppress, ignite, silence. The smell of fuel and scorched earth lingered for miles. By the end of the first week, the Marines had burned through hundreds of gallons of napalm and gasoline. Even tank crews adapted, mounting flamethrowers on M4 Shermans, creating Satan tanks capable of spewing liquid fire over 150 feet. Japanese soldiers, who had mocked the weapon as primitive, now feared it more than any gun. They described it as the weapon that erased courage. Once a flame hit the entrance of a cave, panic spread instantly. Men scrambled for air, many choosing suicide over burning alive. Entire positions were abandoned under the roar of fire. The deeper the Marines advanced, the more desperate the resistance became. At night, hundreds of Japanese soldiers launched infiltration attacks, slipping through the lines, screaming, bayoneting sleeping men, then vanishing again into darkness. By day, flamethrowers lit the same ground they had captured hours earlier. Saipan became a cycle of exhaustion and terror. Each hill, each cave, each bunker demanded new sacrifices. Water ran low. The tropical heat turned corpses into stench and disease. And yet the advance continued, unstoppable, inch by inch. By late June, the Americans had cut the island in half. The Japanese command knew they were finished, but surrender was forbidden. General Yoshitsugu Saito ordered every remaining soldier to fight to the death, and to take as many Americans with them as possible. The stage was set for the bloodiest climax of the Pacific Island War so far, a final desperate onslaught that would turn Saipan into a burning inferno of men and metal. By late June 1944, Saipan was no longer an island. It was a furnace. The Japanese defense line had collapsed into chaos. Cut off from supplies, out of water, and surrounded on all sides, the Imperial troops had one final option: die fighting. General Yoshitsugu Saito, trapped in his bunker near the northern cliffs, knew there would be no evacuation and no reinforcements. American artillery had pounded every square inch of the island for days. Food was gone, ammunition nearly spent. Yet his final order was chillingly simple: you will advance and die. Each man will kill 10 of the enemy before his own death. What came next would become the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. At dawn on July 7th, over 3,000 Japanese soldiers, many of them wounded or unarmed, massed in silence behind a shattered ridge. Some carried rifles, others only bayonets, swords, or even sharpened bamboo sticks. Doctors, engineers and clerks joined the line. They knew it was suicide, but they went anyway. When the signal flares lit the sky, they came screaming out of the darkness. Thousands of voices merged into a single roar. Banzai! Banzai! The 105th Infantry Regiment, positioned on the front line, took the full impact. Machine guns tore through the first wave, but the sheer mass of attackers overran American positions. Within minutes, hundreds of Marines and soldiers were engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Japanese troops charged into foxholes, bayoneting anyone they found. Entire gun crews were wiped out before they could reload. Even wounded men crawled forward with grenades in their hands, detonating themselves among the Americans. It was a massacre on both sides. The American line buckled, then held. Tanks rushed forward, their machine guns cutting down charging figures in the smoke. Flamethrowers roared to life again. Long, sweeping arcs of fire incinerating the second and third waves. Napalm tanks cleared the brush, turning hundreds of attackers into silhouettes of ash. By mid-morning, the ground was carpeted with bodies. Nearly 4,300 Japanese soldiers lay dead. The 105th Regiment lost over 400 Americans in a single morning, one of the deadliest days of the Pacific Campaign. But the battle wasn't over. Scattered Japanese groups continued fighting for days, ambushing patrols and refusing to surrender. In the cliffs of Marpi Point, hundreds of civilians, convinced by propaganda that Americans would torture them, threw themselves off the cliffs with their children. The cries of despair echoed across the sea. When it finally ended on July 9, 1944, Saipan was a graveyard. Over 30,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. Only 921 prisoners had been taken alive. American forces suffered more than 14,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. But the cost had meaning. Saipan's capture placed U.S. bombers within direct range of Tokyo. From the island's new airfields, B-29 superfortresses would soon rise to strike the Japanese mainland. A campaign that would burn Japan's cities and bring the war closer to its final reckoning. Saipan marked a turning point. It wasn't just a military victory, it was the psychological collapse of Imperial Japan's defensive myth. The invincible soldiers who once mocked American flamethrowers were now gone, consumed by the very fire they laughed at. On that blackened island, surrounded by the Pacific's endless horizon, the message was clear. The war was turning, and Japan would never recover from the flames of Saipan. When the last gunfire faded over Saipan, the island was silent. But that silence carried across oceans. The battle had lasted 24 days, and its outcome stunned the world. For Japan, Saipan wasn't just a lost island. It was the collapse of the empire's outer shield, the first breach in the inner ring that protected the home islands. The Imperial General Staff had promised the Japanese people that no American soldier would ever come close to their shores. Saipan was nearly 1,300 miles from Tokyo, a distance that had once felt safe. But now, the unthinkable had happened. The enemy was at the gate. In Tokyo, news of Saipan's fall triggered panic and disbelief. Government propaganda had insisted that Japan was winning. The truth could no longer be hidden. Entire divisions had been annihilated. The civilian suicides at Marpi Point, thousands of men, women, and children leaping from cliffs into the sea, were broadcast as acts of heroic loyalty. But even within Japan's military command, they were seen as a haunting symbol of hopelessness. Then came the political earthquake. On July 18, 1944, just 9 days after Saipan fell, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the face of Japan's militarism, resigned under pressure. He had promised victory, and Saipan's loss proved he could deliver only defeat. The fall of Saipan directly shattered the illusion of Japan's invincibility. Tojo's cabinet collapsed, his prestige destroyed. For the United States, Saipan marked a grim but decisive triumph. It became the launch point for B-29 Superfortress bombers, finally within striking range of Japan's industrial heartland. From new airfields carved out of Saipan's coral rock, the U.S. Army Air Forces began their assault on the Japanese homeland. Within months, American bombers were over Tokyo for the first time since the Doolittle raid. But for the men who fought there, Saipan was not a victory to celebrate. It was a memory they couldn't escape. The Marines and soldiers of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, along with the 27th Infantry Division, had seen the worst of the Pacific War. The smell of burning flesh, the cries of civilians, and the mass suicide cliffs were carved into their minds forever. Many of them called Saipan the Island of Madness. Survivors remembered the unbearable heat, the stench of death, the endless fear of ambush from tunnels and caves. Engineers had to clear hundreds of Japanese holdouts long after the battle ended. Soldiers who would rather starve than surrender. Even weeks later, gunshots still echoed at night as lone Japanese fighters ended their lives in the hills. The human toll was beyond calculation. Entire Japanese families perished. Over 20,000 civilians were killed, many by suicide. For American troops, it was a sobering realization. This war would not end in negotiation. It would end only when Japan itself was destroyed or broken beyond recovery. In the Pacific Command's war rooms, planners saw the scale of resistance and drew a grim conclusion. If Japanese troops fought this hard on Saipan, how hard would they fight on the home islands? The answer shaped everything that followed. The bombing campaigns, the island hopping toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and ultimately, the decision that would lead to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Saipan wasn't just a battlefield. It was the psychological turning point of the Pacific War. It showed both sides the true cost of the final phase. Japan would never again mount a major counteroffensive. The war's momentum had shifted irreversibly to the United States. From the ashes of Saipan, Japan's empire began to collapse, not with a sudden fall, but with the slow, inevitable crumble of a nation pushed past its breaking point. The battle for Saipan ended in July 1944, but its impact echoed until the war's final day. For Japan, the loss of Saipan wasn't just territorial, it was spiritual. The island had been called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, the gateway to the homeland. When it fell, even Japan's most loyal citizens began to realize the truth. The empire could be defeated. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese mainland was vulnerable. From Saipan's newly built airfields, B-29 Superfortress bombers took off toward Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. The flight was long, nearly 1,500 miles. But it was now possible. In less than 6 months, Japan's cities would burn beneath the same kind of flames that had consumed the caves and cliffs of Saipan. The psychological effect on Japan's leadership was devastating. Emperor Hirohito, once insulated from the realities of war, received direct reports of the mass suicides and military collapse on Saipan. Witnesses described him sitting in silence, staring at maps, as generals explained the hopelessness of their situation. It was a moment that cracked the illusion of divine victory. From that point on, every Japanese island garrison fought with a single understanding: that surrender was no longer possible, only death. The seeds of that belief were planted on Saipan. watered in blood and fire. For the Allies, Saipan became a symbol of both triumph and warning. It proved that victory in the Pacific was possible, but only through unimaginable cost. Every beach, every hill, every village would demand thousands of lives. Military planners looked at the carnage on Saipan and saw the future. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and eventually a projected invasion of Japan that could cost 1 million Allied casualties. That prediction haunted Washington. The brutality of Saipan, the mass suicides, the fanatical resistance, the civilian casualties, became a case study for U.S. strategists. It shaped the decision to unleash a new weapon that promised to end the war without a mainland invasion. Without Saipan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki might never have been chosen as the alternative to endless slaughter. But for the men who fought there, the Hellfire Island was not a political lesson. It was a wound. Marines who survived Saipan carried the memory for life. The smell of burning coral and flesh, the screams in the cliffs, the flash of the flamethrower in the dark. Some never spoke about it again. Others said the battle stripped away every illusion of glory. They had seen the Pacific War for what it truly was, a slow, grinding apocalypse fought yard by yard, man against man, until nothing human remained. In the end, Saipan's legacy was both terrible and essential. It marked the point where Japan's expansion turned into retreat, where the empire of the rising sun began to set for good. It was the battle that brought America to Japan's doorstep and lit the path to the war's final inferno. The irony was undeniable. The Japanese troops, who once laughed at American flamethrowers, were consumed by their own arrogance. By fire, they couldn't escape. And as the world would soon see, the flames of Saipan were only the beginning. They would grow into the firestorms over Tokyo, the blinding light of Hiroshima, and the silence that followed Japan's surrender in 1945. The island still stands today, a quiet, tropical paradise washed clean by time. But beneath its soil lies the memory of the war's most defining lesson. That pride, when fused with fanaticism, can burn an entire nation to ashes. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe to WW2 Heroes Legends, where the courage, tragedy, and sacrifice of real soldiers live on through true stories of World War II. Because history deserves to be remembered, and the men who fought it never forgotten.